Okay, I guess we can get started. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Appreciate you all joining us today. My name is Joe DiLorenzo. I'm the Chief Safety Officer here at FTA. I appreciate you all joining us for an overview of the risk-based inspections program, which I think, as you all know, is a required update from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. We've started some work on this project and wanted to provide you with an update of where we are. Be able to provide you some information ahead of time and lay out all the timelines and hopefully have some time to answer some questions. So again, I appreciate everybody joining us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Powell, who is going to be your guide today through the presentation, and be looking forward to addressing any other issues that come up. So with that, I'll turn it over to Aaron, and we can go ahead and get started.
Joe, thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon to the SSO community. I am happy to be presenting to you the basic requirements mandated by Congress under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for risk-based inspections, as well as lay out the framework of a risk-based inspection program. My goal today is to ensure that all SSOAs have a basic understanding of the updates to the National Public Transportation Safety Program related to risk-based inspections, and to outline for SSOAs how FTA plans to implement those requirements. Without further delay, let's get started. I'd like to quickly go over today's agenda. I'm going to provide background on the risk-based inspection program requirements and outline FTA's definition of risk-based inspections. Next, I will discuss the agencies that will be impacted by risk-based inspections and how. We will also talk about the major provisions of risk-based inspections as part of the National Public Transportation Safety Program. After reviewing the basics of the law, we will move into FTA's approach for implementing risk-based inspections and how FTA plans to assist SSOAs in complying with these new requirements. FTA will issue a special directive to each SSOA and also plans to provide technical assistance through an accompanying toolkit. Next, we will talk about the timeline for the special directive's issuance and risk-based inspection program implementation. Finally, we will answer some questions related to the program as a whole. FTA is providing this webinar as an introduction to risk-based inspections as required by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. We are still working internally on the specifics of the risk-based inspection program, including development of the special directives and toolkit. Therefore, I will not be able to provide detailed answers to some areas of the program that are not yet finalized. However, I will provide as much information as I can to ensure that SSOAs can begin preparing to develop and implement their risk-based inspection programs. Let's start with some background of the new requirements for the risk-based inspection program. FTA has considered risk-based inspections a best practice within the transit industry for some time. However, until Congress passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law on November 15, 2021, there was no requirement for SSOAs to implement a risk-based inspection program. With the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, FTA must now ensure SSOAs develop and implement a risk-based inspection program. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law also requires that FTA assess each SSOA's capability to conduct risk-based inspections. Further, Congress has directed FTA to issue a special directive to each SSOA requiring them to develop and implement a risk-based inspection program that includes each rail transit system that the SSOA oversees. I know most SSOAs have never received a special directive from FTA. Therefore, later in the presentation, I will spend several minutes explaining special directives to the group and what you can expect. I'd like to start our discussion of risk-based inspections by defining a risk-based inspection program. A risk-based inspection program uses qualitative and quantitative data analysis to inform ongoing inspection activities. Risk-based inspection programs are designed to prioritize inspections to address safety concerns and hazards associated with the highest levels of safety risk. While it seems straightforward, a risk-based inspection program will require SSOAs to use data to inform their inspection practices with the goal of addressing the highest risk elements and safety conditions. Now that we covered the requirements and defined a risk-based inspection program, let's look at how the risk-based inspection program will impact the industry. Risk-based inspection programs will be carried out by each SSOA. However, the program places requirements and responsibilities on more than just SSOAs. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law requires FTA, each SSOA, and Rail Transit Agency to participate in the national implementation of risk-based inspections. The following 3 slides address some of these requirements. The National Public Transportation Safety Program requires that FTA issue a special directive to each SSOA on the development and implementation of risk-based inspection programs. These special directives must be issued no later than November 15th, 2022. FTA is currently developing these special directives. In addition to issuing special directives requiring the development and implementation of risk-based inspection programs, FTA is tasked with ensuring SSOAs can meet the requirements of such programs. This means that FTA must ensure that the inspection practices of each SSOA are commensurate with the number, size, and complexity of the agencies the SSOA oversees. FTA must ensure the SSOA's inspection programs are risk-based, and FTA must ensure that SSOAs have sufficient resources to conduct inspections. As I mentioned earlier, SSOAs are tasked with carrying out risk-based inspection programs that comply with the law. Let's look at the requirements specific to SSOAs. First, SSOAs must have the authority to enter the facilities of each rail transit agency they oversee to perform inspections of infrastructure, equipment, records, personnel, and data. This authority can be derived from state law, executive order, or another vehicle. It is important that SSOAs review their legal authorities to ensure they can access the rail transit systems they oversee for inspections both with and without notice. If SSOAs do not have this authority, SSOAs will need to work with their states to ensure these authorities are granted. Because legal authority can be tied to a state's legislative processes and timing, FTA encourages SSOAs to review these authorities now and take appropriate action if necessary. Additionally, Congress has mandated that SSOAs work with their RTAs in 2 key ways for risk-based inspections. First, SSOAs must create policies and procedures in consultation with each RTA they oversee to conduct risk-based inspections, both with and without notice. Second, SSOAs must create policies and procedures in consultation with each RTA it oversees that ensures that rail transit agencies provide their SSOAs with the data that the RTA collects when identifying and evaluating safety risks. Both of the above policies and procedures must be codified in the SSOA's program standard. Lastly, rail transit agencies have a required role to play in risk-based inspections. As I mentioned earlier, Congress has mandated that two specific areas of policies and procedures must be developed in consultation between SSOAs and RTAs. Rail transit agencies and SSOAs are required to build policies and procedures in consultation that address access to the rail transit systems so that risk-based inspections can be conducted both with and without advance notice. Additionally, RTAs and SSOAs must build policies and procedures in consultation that outline the specifics of data sharing. Under the law, each RTA must share with its SSOA the data it collects when identifying and evaluating safety risks. Similar to the requirements levied on the SSOAs, which requires access and data sharing policies and procedures to be incorporated into the state's program standard, each RTA must incorporate access and data sharing policies and procedures into their agency safety plan. Now that we've discussed responsibilities, I'd like to talk about the timing of FTA's implementation of the risk-based inspection program. Congress provided a timeline for the implementation of the risk-based inspection program. First, FTA has been tasked to issue special directives to each SSOA requiring the development and implementation of a risk-based inspection program no later than 1 year following the enactment of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is November 15th, 2022. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law requires that SSOAs implement their risk-based inspection program 2 years after the issuance of the special directive. You'll notice in this slide that FTA has used the approximately November 15th, 2024 as the deadline for SSOAs to implement their risk-based inspection programs. I'd like to reiterate that the implementation date is tied to FTA's issuance of the special directives, not to the specific date of November 15th, 2024. While FTA intends to issue the special directives no later than November 15th, 2022, a specific date for their issuance has not yet been determined. You'll see in the middle of this slide, projected 2023. In addition to the special directives that the FTA must issue, FTA intends to incorporate risk-based inspection programs into an update of the State Safety Oversight Program. That regulatory update is projected to occur during 2023. While these two processes are very much related, the regulatory update is not intended to interfere with the requirements of the special directive and its implementation. We're going to transition from the requirements of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law into the approach FTA is taking to implement the risk-based inspection program, which will include the required special directive and a toolkit similar to what FTA provided for certification several years ago. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about special directives, since most SSOAs and transit agencies have not received a special directive. First, FTA's authority to issue special directives is found in both the National Public Transportation Safety Program and FTA's Special Directive Authority. Special directives are issued for a few prescribed reasons, including if the public interest requires the avoidance or mitigation of a hazard or risk. In this case, Congress is directing FTA to issue special directives for the purpose of developing and implementing risk-based inspection programs. Each special directive will include a statement of purpose and will include descriptions of the subjects or issues to be involved. Importantly for each SSOA to understand, the special directives will include a statement of the actions that the SSOA will be required to perform and will include both an effective date and a compliance date. FTA does not intend to share the special directives on the risk-based inspection program today with the industry. However, FTA has issued several special directives in recent years that are available publicly online that SSOAs can review as an example of what a special directive contains. As we know, each SSOA will be issued a special directive on the development and implementation of risk-based inspections. FTA intends to fully address both development and implementation of risk-based inspection programs within the context of the special directive. Additionally, the special directives will be issued no later than November 15th of this year. Now, I'd like to address how the special directive will be used to ensure that each program meets the requirements of the National Public Transportation Safety Program. As I mentioned earlier, the special directive will include a statement of actions being sought and a compliance date. For each required action, SSOAs will be required to submit documentation that demonstrate their risk-based inspection program meets those requirements. Once proper documentation has been submitted and FTA has verified that the SSOA's risk-based inspection program is compliant with the special directive and the National Public Transportation Safety Program, FTA will close the special directive by notifying the SSOA that all requirements are satisfied and that the special directive is no longer open. As FTA issues the required special directives, FTA intends to release an accompanying toolkit to help SSOAs with the development and implementation of their risk-based inspection programs. The approach is intended to be similar to the certification process and toolkit that FTA released prior to the certification requirements several years ago. In fact, the toolkit FTA intends to release for risk-based inspections was based on the format of the certification toolkit in an effort to provide SSOAs a format that they were already familiar with. The risk-based inspection special directive that each SSOA will receive will be the binding document for each SSOA's risk-based inspection program. The risk-based inspection program toolkit will be a non-binding document that further explains the requirements of the National Public Transportation Safety Program and the special directive. The toolkit provides expanded background and information and is intended to assist SSOAs in complying with the special directive. The toolkit has been designed to align closely with the requirements of the special directive. FTA intends to release the toolkit at the same time as the special directives. As a matter of organization and similar to the certification process, FTA has organized the risk-based inspection program into 6 distinct categories that address specific requirements of risk-based inspections outlined by the National Public Transportation Safety Program. These components are 1, SSOA authority to perform risk-based inspections. 2, ensuring that risk-based inspections have policies and procedures. 3, data sources and data collection. 4, inspection prioritization. 5, risk-based inspection practices are commensurate with the number, size, and complexity of the rail transit systems an SSOA oversees. And 6, SSOAs have the staffing, training, and qualifications to conduct risk-based inspections. I'm going to take just a couple minutes to expand on the categories of the risk-based inspection toolkit. However, the information I'll provide next is still under FTA internal review and may be subject to change. Category 1 of the toolkit. SSOA authority to perform risk-based inspections focuses on legal authority. The SSOA's program standard should clearly define the scope of the SSOA's access to each rail transit agency it oversees. A robust risk-based inspection program requires that SSOAs have the authority to access and inspect the full spectrum of activities at each transit agency. At a minimum, SSOAs must have explicit authority to access transit agencies to inspect infrastructure, equipment, records, personnel, and data. Category 2 of the toolkit, risk-based inspections, policies, and procedures, focuses on the necessary policies and procedures for risk-based inspections. These policies and procedures should include detailed descriptions of the processes the SSOA will use to conduct inspections of each transit agency it oversees, both with and without advance notice. The SSOA may choose to develop policies and procedures tailored to each transit agency in its jurisdiction, or to develop overarching policies and procedures for multiple rail transit agencies if that is more practical for the SSOA. These policies and procedures should address notifications to the rail transit agencies to conduct inspections with and without notice, access procedures and escorts, and access policies and procedures that encompass all distinct areas of the rail transit agency. Category 3 of the toolkit addresses data sources and data collection. A risk-based inspection program requires the collection and analysis of large data sets and a mechanism for evaluating that data to inform inspection activities. The rail transit agencies must share safety data with the SSOA so that the SSOA can use that data as part of their risk-based inspection program. SSOAs, in consultation with each rail transit agency the SSOA oversees, must establish policies and procedures for collecting and sharing data. Category 4 of the toolkit addresses inspection prioritization. A risk-based inspection program requires that SSOAs prioritize inspection activity through data analysis. SSOAs can use the information derived from data analysis to guide the implementation of their risk-based inspection programs so that the highest risk conditions are addressed first. Data review and analysis should be done continuously so that changes within a transit system are reflected in the risk-based inspection programs. SSOAs should perform comprehensive data analysis of various types, including equipment, infrastructure, and practices specific to each transit system, incident verification, ongoing monitoring to include procedures, maintenance, and operations, defects and corrective or remedial action, and CAPS and safety risk mitigation verification. Category 5 of the risk-based inspection toolkit attempts to define the guidelines to ensure that SSOA's risk-based inspection program has practices that are commensurate with the number, size, and complexity of the rail transit systems the SSOA oversees. The SSOA must ensure that the risk-based inspection program it develops considers the number, size, and complexity of the agencies under its authority. While risk-based inspections should be frequent and consistent, not all transit systems share the same risk profile. The SSOA should tailor the scope of its inspection activities for each transit system based on its size and complexity and the SSOA's safety prioritization activity. For example, the SSOAs may implement a more robust inspection program at its multimodal transit agencies than at a single mode transit agency if collected data validates that decision. Similarly, if an SSOA oversees a transit agency that is less complex but has a higher level of safety risk due to known non-conformance with operational policies and procedures or poor safety culture, the SSOA may determine to prioritize more risk-based inspections on that agency in a particular year. Category 6 of the toolkit addresses the SSOA's capacity to conduct risk-based inspections, including SSOA staffing, training, and qualifications. Each SSOA must have sufficient staff and resources to conduct the risk-based inspection program. The staff must have the capacity to perform risk-based inspection program activity for each transit system it oversees in a manner commensurate with the size, number, and complexity of those systems. As states begin thinking about building their risk-based inspection programs, an area that I'd like to talk about is the method to transform data from the RTAs into targeted and relevant inspection activities. Risk-based inspections start with data that must be transformed into prioritized inspection practices. The first step in inspection prioritization is to determine which safety metrics will be used. The SSOA must determine and incorporate into the program standard the specific safety metrics the SSOA will use to prioritize inspections by evaluating relevant data. Relevant data includes data shared by the RTA, such as safety program data, maintenance data, and inspection data. SSOAs should perform comprehensive data analysis of safety program metrics data, maintenance data, and inspection data types, and this analysis should inform SSOA's risk-based inspection elements and practices. The second step in inspection prioritization is to develop prioritization procedures. The SSOA should establish methods to analyze the collected data to prioritize safety concerns for inspection. The SSOA can develop this prioritization methodology to meet the demands of its program. As part of this methodology, the SSOA would group elements into categories and then develop a corresponding prioritization score or rating. For example, the SSOA could rate vehicle maintenance risks by car or car series, depending on the available data. The score or rating of each category may be calculated differently and should be tailored to the specifics of both the data collected and the specific category. The third step in inspection prioritization is to prioritize inspection activities within each transit agency and between all transit agencies the SSOA oversees. The SSOA should develop policies and procedures that describe how to prioritize inspections for each rail transit agency it oversees and how it will inform each agency of the specific risk-based inspections. If an SSOA oversees more than one rail transit agency, the SSOA should also develop a procedure for clearly identifying and prioritizing safety concerns among the rail transit agencies. There should be clear documentation that relates safety concerns and prioritization analysis to risk-based inspection activities. Data analysis and prioritization should be an ongoing process of collecting data, analyzing that data, developing prioritization ratings, and prioritizing inspections. SSOAs should build inspections of equipment, infrastructure, and practices specific to each rail transit agency, incident verification, ongoing monitoring to include procedures, maintenance, and operations, defects and corrective or remedial actions, and CAPS and safety risk mitigation verification. At this time, I have concluded laying out FTA's approach to the special directive and the toolkit. Now, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on where FTA assesses the industry to be in developing their risk-based inspection programs and areas where FTA is watching closely. This chart reflects FTA's assessment of SSOA's existing inspection programs and compares them to the requirements of the National Public Transportation Safety Program. The categories listed here are intended to reflect the components addressed in the earlier slide. As you know, most SSOAs are already conducting some form of inspections on their rail transit agencies. However, FTA does not assess that the inspections are developed using a risk framework. Therefore, most SSOAs will be updating their programs to reflect these new requirements. I'd like to reflect on 3 of these categories. FTA assesses that most SSOAs have the legal authority to access rail transit agencies for the purpose of inspections. FTA encourages every SSOA to verify they have the authority to access their rail transit agencies for inspections both with and without notice now, because as I mentioned earlier, if updating this authority is necessary, it may require state legislative action. Second, FTA assesses that only 10% of SSOAs have an inspection program that is risk-based. FTA considers that this area will be the most transformative process change for SSOAs as they continue existing inspection programs. Third, I'd like to address staffing. FTA understands that implementing a risk-based inspection program may require agencies to hire additional staff depending on current staffing and the level of inspections within the agencies, and based on the additional requirements of the National Public Transportation Safety Program. As with certification, FTA intends to ensure that SSOAs have the resources to implement a risk-based inspection program, and our processes for assessing staffing will be similar to those used for certification. Lastly, FTA would like to acknowledge the current situation of SSOAs related to risk-based inspections and highlight a few areas. First, FTA acknowledges the disruption that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused to inspections of transit agencies. In many cases, inspections of transit agencies were paused and are only now resuming. While this is the consideration, I'd just like to remind the group that full implementation of risk-based inspection programs will not begin until approximately November of 2024. Second, and as I mentioned before, FTA encourages SSOAs to begin reviewing their staffing plans and enabling legislation, since those areas take time and implementation of the programs will be required in a little more than 2 years. I'd like to turn it back over to Joe to lead the question and answer session and then wrap up today's webinar.
Great, thanks, Erin, and I appreciate the informative presentation. Great job. So we do have a few questions that we're going to answer. I appreciate everybody's time and attention to the webinar today, and we hope you found it helpful. So we're going to address some of the frequently asked questions that we've gotten so far about the program. If you have a question, though, that's not addressed now or that you think of later, whatever the case happens to be, you can use the email ftassodocs@dot.gov, which is on the slide. So please feel free to send us your questions. That'll be very helpful for us, not only so that we can provide you with that information, but we also will use that to make sure that maybe any materials that we develop along the way will be helpful to you when it comes to implementation. So let's get started with the first question. So Erin, you mentioned the timeframes. Can you go back over this a little bit for us? Will FTA issue the special directives to the SSOAs on November 15th of this year or sooner? Can you just clarify that for us, please?
Yep, so FTA is still working to build the special directives and the toolkit, and we intend to follow the BIL and issue the special directives no later than November 15th, 2022, but we will not issue them before September 1st of this year. Okay,
great. Thank you. The next question kind of goes back to the slide that you just showed about which SSOAs have risk-based inspection programs already. And so the question is, if a state already conducts risk-based inspections and has a program, then will they still receive a special directive?
So all SSOAs will be receiving a special directive with specific requirements that must be addressed. And once an SSOA has met the requirements of the special directive, they can submit their verification to FTA. After FTA verifies that there's a compliant program, FTA will close the special directive for the SSOA.
Okay, so for somebody that already has a program, it may go faster than somebody that is starting fresh.
As long as a state meets the requirements of the special directive, FTA will review required submissions and then could close that potentially faster.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Will an SSOA be required to hire additional people in order to help conduct these risk-based inspections?
So SSOAs will be required to build a risk-based inspection program that mirrors the oversight that they're required to do. So it's possible that SSOAs may have to increase their staffing to meet those requirements. If there's already a compliant risk-based inspection program, FTA would assess the workload and then act accordingly.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. The next question is, will there be a public comment period before the special directives are issued for the risk-based inspection program?
No, a public comment period is not required prior to the issuance of special directives, and there will not be a public comment period on risk-based inspections prior to November 15th of this year. However, when the FTA updates CFR 674 to include inspections that are risk-based, there will be a public comment period.
Okay, understood. And just kind of another plug though now for the email address, if you have questions, again, those can be, if you have questions or comments and you submit them to us, to the extent that we can in the process, we will try and include those. And the last question that we have for today, Aaron, is what are the areas that the SSOA should start preparing for as they anticipate the issuance of the special directives for the risk-based inspection program?
Yep. So as I've foot stomped several times in this presentation, FTA is hoping that SSOAs will begin reviewing their enabling legislation and confirm they have the authority to access transit agencies with and without prior notice for inspections.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you very much. That's the end of the questions that we have time for today. So again, I wanted to thank Aaron for the presentation and thank everybody for their time and attention to the webinar today. We hope we found it useful. We will be recording the presentation. We have recorded the presentation and we will be sending it to each of you through email. And again, just one last time, just to mention that if you have questions or anything about the presentation today, please send them to the email address that's up on the screen, the FTA SSO docs@dot.gov. So again, thank you for joining and have a good rest of your day.